An Experiment in Choice by Desmond Stewart. As the young man crossed the square, he was not sure that he was followed. He was certainly not worried. In this city it was always likely that one was being investigated. The people who worked for the police had to put in reports. Otherwise they might be dismissed or investigated themselves. You did not notice spies more than you noticed beggars. He passed the statues without returning their blank stares, and was lost in the crowd buying tickets at the various windows. 3 trains were waiting at different bays. There was comfort in crowds, an anonymity that came as a relief, like a cigarette. As he lit up, he was aware, it was the last thing he was aware of, that the cigarette had fallen to the ground. Then darkness, without pain. He awoke under the sun, his eyes staring at a sky innocently blue. No smell of industry trailed the cloud that moved from right to left. His body was agreeably warm, but he could not move. His naked legs and arms were clamped in iron grips. The grips were not painful. They simply kept him where he was, spread-eagled on his back. A bird scooped near him, a small bird, carried on the breeze. He sensed that it was early. Time passed, and his first strugglings against the iron bonds eased. The drug they had given him perhaps made him languid, and as he gazed at the sky, he remembered days from his childhood, long ago, and fishing in small ponds. The clouds had been diaphanous even then, sailing through noons that lasted, it seemed, forever. Suddenly the bonds were gone. Noiselessly, smoothly, they had retracted. He sat up, then trembled. For as he realized where he was, a vertiginous nausea banished the idyllic fantasies which had kept him quiet. He wanted to scream, but he was so high above the world that to scream seemed pointless. And on so narrow a wall, it seemed a wall, he was lying naked on a flat ledge with a narrow slot down its centre. It was not a ledge, it was a catwalk. And not straight, it was circular. And he was high above the world, hundreds of feet above a green and blue morning world, with trees like bushes. They were so far below, and no sign of factories, except where in the distance a grey haze was moored to chimneys. He was lying on the lips of one such chimney, and he was alone. The polished surface on which he lay was empty, except that a few feet behind his head was a plastic flask and a plate with bread. Outside, he recoiled as he looked. Outside was a drop of hundreds of feet, a drop only inches from his left arm and leg. He lay back, his breath panting, looking at the sky which now seemed ironical and cruel. Winged creatures had vanished. He half sat up again, terrified that vertigo might send him crashing to his death. He looked to the right, a few inches from his scrabbling hand. There it was dark, the inner darkness of a funnel, a cold abyss. There were no fires, there was no soot, only darkness, a receding inner darkness going down and down. A helicopter must have brought him here. He imagined it hovering, and figures in helmets gingerly stepping, acrobats with heads for heights, onto this curving wall and strapping him here. He looked where the bonds had been, sockets in the surface. Controlled manacles could come up and could retreat. He moved his limbs so that they were invulnerable to any counterattack from this silent machinery. And he noticed idly that the curving platform on which he lay had, down its centre, a long dark slit. He wondered what it was for. His heartbeats grew more normal and, still gingerly, he sat up. He needed the flask. He wanted to drink. Very slowly he pulled himself back and round towards the flask and the bread. In truth, the ledge was not dangerous. If he kept his head, the chimney was sufficiently large for the curve to be gradual. If he had been a steeplejack, he could have stood up and walked, even run, round the circle. He shuddered, knowing how bad he was at heights. Under the flask lay a sheet of typed paper. He pulled it free and found a message, or rather a set of instructions. Drink the water, eat the bread. They are sufficient for your needs. He sipped the water. Its presence could only mean that he would soon be rescued. Even so, he should eke it out, and there were only 2 small loaves. He continued reading. You are the subject of an experiment. You have had 147 predecessors. You are situated on the summit of a steel-topped chimney. Here there is no deception. All is as you see it, a dark interior, an exterior whitewashed wall. You were laid here shortly before dawn. You can leave by jumping outwards or inwards, but you will decide before noon. This was ridiculous. He had been brought by helicopter. He could be rescued by helicopter. Why should he be so insane as to jump either way? He read on. You will be perusing this at about 8 a.m. You will eat your breakfast at 8:10. Soon you will observe a change in your environment. You have already remarked a narrow aperture in the platform on which you are lying. At 9 a.m. a steel blade, knife sharp, in the form of a cylinder, will emerge from its slot and begin to rise. By noon it will have reached a height of 7 feet. Why did we select you? He put the paper down and felt cautiously inside the slot. There was barely room for his small finger. There was nothing to feel. The walls were polished. We wished to add a quota of intellectuals to our selectees for this test. We inform you, for your interest, that 93 of the previous subjects of this experiment chose to jump inwards. But of those, only 9 could be classed as educated, and not one was above the average in intellect. Finally, may we thank you for your cooperation? It was a nightmare, but under a fine sky, in a pastoral landscape. This tower, what lay at the bottom? Inside, all was dark. Those who jumped inwards could never have known what they jumped towards. Outwards. He peered prudently over the edge, then withdrew from the frightening perspective. He drank more water and chewed a loaf. He would simply wait. His adrenaline had pumped alarm to his veins. Now he was calm again. They had put him here. They could rescue him. The experiment was on his nerves. He would have liked to smoke, but there were no cigarettes and no matches. Then suddenly his senses came alert. There was not a sound, but a movement below him, in the slot. He could see nothing, but he sensed motion, and then he knew what it was. The slot was empty no longer. It was filled as with ink. What filled it was blue-black and flush with the ledge. Flush only for a moment. A ridge of oiled steel began to rise in slow and inexorable silence. His narrow space was now bisected. He could lie down no longer. He felt the edge, now a thumb height above the surface, sharp as a Japanese sword of execution. He crouched, his legs either side of the silent cylinder. Wildly he looked over the side. Perhaps somewhere there were steps. A steeplejack's ladder? He crawled round the chimney. This was it, a test of nerve, to lower himself over, to cling like a fly and descend the 400 feet of gently curving wall. He crawled the agonizing circuit back to the plastic flask. There were no steps. Inside then, perhaps just lower than the darkness, was a ladder to safety. But who could know? Who could see? He wondered what impelled those who had jumped before. Crouching there beneath the sun, in a tortured dialogue, he rehearsed reasons. Inwards, back to the womb, into darkness. That was the impulse, the hope, below reason, that as they fell, it would be to some warm, enfolding cushion. And outwards? He calculated. Only 53 had jumped outwards. They were the vigorous ones, the hopeful, and yet hopeless. At least in darkness there were hopes. Outwards. He peered, but from this height the scrubby, uneven ground was indecipherable. There was a tattooing of small black points on the earth. Were they stones or bushes? There must be some hope in this situation. Perhaps the dark points were the meshes of a net. But as he squinted again, he doubted. More likely they were spikes. And at this thought his body began to tremble, as with a fever. By now the slow sliding steel was fast approaching his groin, so he half stood, and lightly laid his hand for support against the side of the rising cylinder. He wondered about the men before him. The paper spoke of them as not above average intellect. He thought of sewage workers or taxi drivers, and the shadow of a smile passed over his lips. He wanted a drink. It was with difficulty that he turned and stooped, avoiding the steel, and drank what was left of the water. He found that he could stand straight, with the rising wall between his legs, up to his knees, only its knife edge dangerous. He threw the flask to his right, down towards the earth, and lost sight of it. He kicked the plate into the chimney, and listened, but heard nothing. He looked up. The sky was ironic and remote, as indifferent to him as to a chimpanzee shot among the stars. He could not believe that the universe concerned itself with the morality of man. Which side should he stand? Bifurcated on the summit of this alien tower, he asked the idle question. The sky did not care, and neither did the earth. Only somewhere a cold human intelligence, if human it was, recorded his decision, for reasons of its own. But suddenly he recognized. It was too late to make a decision. The steel had come too high. He could not lift his leg over without falling. And still the steel rose, smooth and silent. At this moment, careless whether the sky heard or not, he began to scream. It was afternoon. The colour and most of the people had fled from the square. A statue cast a narrow shade in which fruit stalls sheltered. A man dressed as a vendor, hardly bothering to play the part, scrutinized the few travellers crossing the white space towards the station. The apparent vendor was alert. A young man was approaching with an old copy of the New Yorker under his arm. "Guard my stall." He threw a coin to a nearby beggar. "I'll be back." Preparing his needle, he followed his next victim into the station where, by the ticket window, few people, but enough, formed an anonymous throng.